Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us on this hot and sweaty evening. Tonight in our Communist Culture Club, we're looking at two issues. First of all, football, and then Shakespeare. Not quite related, but I'm sure both will be really interesting sessions. Now, if you're like me, and perhaps you are, football, I'm trying to stay away from it, to be honest, especially the Euros. I try to stay away from the nationalism. I cannot stand it. And also, it's got a bit of sexism going on. Like, if you're not, apparently it only is coming home if the men win something. So the women's victory 2 years ago doesn't really count, which I thought was a bit off. So we're looking at the issue from a different perspective tonight. And we've got with us Carl, who's got a political point of view and sees football as an arena of the class struggle. And I thought that's a really good counter viewpoint on the sort of football we've been seeing the last few weeks non-stop. Welcome, Carl. I'm going to show some pictures while you're talking. So off you go.
Thanks, Tina. Firstly, I'd like to say I'm aware of some of the quality of some of the academics and authors and Marxists that have appeared on this forum. So my imposter syndrome's looming large as a roofer from a council estate. But I'm also aware of a talk that took place recently in regards to capitalism and sport. So I'll try not to be too repetitive. But obviously there will be a bit of crossover in the subjects that we're talking to. But I do come at the question from a slightly different angle, in that my main proposition is that football has developed alongside capitalism. And as the different periods of capitalist development have been reflected in the game of football itself, the clashes and antagonisms that have taken place from the earliest stages of football right up until today, in many respects, can be understood as having a class nature. And in addition to that, a culture has developed around football between fans and a wider society. And those antagonisms and clashes manifest themselves through that culture, and vice versa. Issues that society are facing can be expressed by fans in stadiums or in wider movements. And unfortunately, I think we'll see that the right wing have been able to colonise that culture better than the left have. They've been successful in engineering a space within that culture to harness their ideas and disseminate their ideas into football fan culture. So the talk will be loosely in three sections: a brief history of the game and some of them early clashes that developed between players, supporters, and the authorities. How the right wing have already understood that culture and the usefulness of in engaging with it. And finish with a few ideas about how we can, on the left, get our asses in gear and maybe start to challenge the right on that front. And at the end, I hope we can share a few ideas on firstly whether that's a viable alternative, whether it's worthwhile doing, and then how we do that. So the definitive origins of the game are disputed. The Aztecs and 3rd century China all have games involving a ball of some sort. The Aboriginal Australians, before the white settlers arrived, had a game that involved a ball of some sort. But the game, perhaps not entirely recognisable, but that most closely linked to what we see as football today, probably has its origins in around about the 12th century. And this game, which was called folkball, would have been a team game, usually played between neighbouring towns and villages, with the purpose of transporting a pig's bladder to a marker in the opposing team's town or village. And it would have been increasingly violent, incredibly violent. There's records of punching, scratching, kicking, clubbing, even stabbings with swords that took place during these games. So completely different to the game we recognise today in that regard, depending on which team you support. There were no clearly defined regulations, no referee, no limit to the amount of people that could have taken part, no limit on the area. Some matches went across several miles, lasting hours, even days. So if we place ourselves in that period in time, the anticipation that was leading up to some of them games, you know, the excitement, fear, trepidation, nervousness, you know, we can only assume there that a feeling of comradeship would have developed, you know, an us and them mentality, and that would have developed within the towns that were competing in these games. But then also over time, a sort of inter-community respect would have developed between people that played the game. And attempts to ban the game at this time would have only intensified that feeling of us and them. When you look into the structure of the time, the feudal structure and then early capitalist structure, these antagonisms and clashes would have taken a class nature. Those looking to ban the game would have included the landowners whose land was being used and in their view, trespassed upon. There's a recorded incident of a man once drowning because they'd set up a game with the sole intention of wrecking the dikes that were being used to drain the fens here in the east of England. And others that made up what would have constituted authority in those days would have been drawn from the gentry and the ruling classes. And they would have been aware of the potential danger in letting the masses come together in this way and letting them feelings of solidarity and us versus them develop. Capitalism, even in its earliest days, has always taken a strong interest in what workers do outside of work. Not only because, you know, we make up the greatest part of the market in which they want to sell their goods, but also because they want to cut any movements in the bud that would have the potential to become a revolutionary force and challenge the system. But banning it, as we know, was largely unsuccessful. There are periods where the game was stopped, but they were unable to ban it for good. So it started to develop, mirroring the development of capitalism. The game was exported around the world. As we discussed earlier, there were games similar that already existed, but the new codified version would have been imposed as part of colonial projects around the world. Neoliberalism would have been reflected in the game through the introduction of markets and privatization of clubs and leagues, private ownership of grounds and facilities, and then the big business ownership of clubs, which led to them being used as assets, possibly to be stripped, to make incredible amounts of money from as it started to develop into an industry. Some owners took over clubs as a means of prestige for owners of questionable repute, shall we say, and more recently, even by states as a means of sports washing their image as dictators or human rights abuses in their own areas and their own regions and countries. So even in the earliest days, a counter movement by ordinary people would have taken place among the masses. A connection can clearly be drawn between class struggle and football since its inception, be it the early sort of 15th century conflicts around private ownership of land, up until the fans opposing the football authorities' fairly recent plans to create a Super League made up of the so-called elite clubs of Europe. So in that last example, I think the general gist of what I'm trying to say is what we saw there was mostly working class ordinary people demonstrating against the plans of the authorities and people in power who were looking to take something away from them in order to increase their already obscene wealth. And my proposition basically is, what is that if it's not class struggle? And in the extreme examples of the period of hooliganism in the 80s, 70s and 80s in Britain, that saw a expression of that class culture, had their own symbols and rituals and fashions, a way of life and identity. I contend that those were a counter movement to the deindustrialization, the unemployment, attacks on working class institutions that were carried out by Thatcher and alike, which left working class communities with little else other than their club through which to express their identity and their anger and frustration. And some of those symbols are still prominent today. The use of the Union Jack, for example, which had later connotations with the far right. And as a result, some left-thinking football fans see that aspect of fan culture as nationalist and negative. I think that's what Cher was alluding to in her introduction. And if there was more time, we'd probably be able to expand on that conversation on whether a sort of feeling of revolutionary defeatism might kick in amongst left-wing fans, where they want their country, if you like, to maybe lose, but we don't have time for that. So I think if we fast forward from them primitive days to a developed capitalism and a developed industry of football, we've seen right-wing political organisations who have been able to exploit the mass participation in football, and they've been able to disseminate their ideas into large groups. The group called the Football Lads Alliance, which later become, ironically, the Democratic Football Lads Alliance, were able to embed themselves within fan bases by embracing that football culture. They're then able to incorporate the ideology and prejudices directly into the movement. And they often preyed on real societal issues and political issues, and then take them onto the terraces. These groups invariably are linked to political organisations such as UKIP, the English Defence League. In the 70s and 80s, it was National Front and the BNP, and they found fertile ground for recruitment. That's where we see the hangover of the symbols that used to be what express national pride have now become linked with those far right movements. But it's not a new tactic. It's something that they've learned from past examples of far right, fascist, racist regimes and people in power using football in order to expand their ideas. Most obvious will probably be the Roman hierarchy using gladiatorial fights and animal hunts to ingratiate themselves with the masses. But when looking at football specifically, the best example would probably be Mussolini in Italy. As a former journalist, he understood the important nature of shaping class consciousness, and he did this with football in the 1920s and 30s in order to reshape public consciousness and make it look on fascism, his fascist regime, favourably. Through propaganda, he was able to foment nationalist sentiment by associating it with the sporting success of the team. Italy won the 1934 and 1938 World Cups, and the football in the 36 Olympics. People older than me may be able to say that this was on merit of pure sporting ability. But Mussolini took no chances with that anyway. It's widely claimed that he influenced the sporting bodies, the organising institutions and the referees to guarantee that he got that success. And given fascism's tendency towards undemocratic control of administrative bodies, it's hard to argue that didn't take place. In the 1938 final, it's believed that he gave a talk to the players and demanded that the team win or die. And when Italy did win, the opponent goalkeeper, a Hungarian, is reported to have said, "I may have let in 4 goals, but at least I saved their lives." And what he was able to do so successfully was to take what he was achieving in football back into wider society. The team wore a black kit to resemble the colours of fascism. They displayed Roman salutes before games, and these images were shared widely across all the propaganda around the country. And to give an idea of how easy that could be to do, if you think back to the lead up to last Sunday's final, all TV, news, radio, newspapers, all geared towards this frenzy of national pride. Whether you engage with football or not, you could see it was coming into your homes via the radio, via TV, via your newspaper. So whether you weren't involved in football, it was hard not to be taken in with this. And you can see how easy that could have, with a slightest little push, been pushed towards more nationalism rather than national pride. Hitler also used this tactic, most prominently in the 36 Berlin Olympics, to promote his fascist regime on the world stage. Sporting success was portrayed as resulting from discipline and power, and that's easy to then filter that through to other aspects of life and create justification for the acceptance of fascist ideas. Here in Britain, the idea of discipline and power shows why some of the elite public schools favoured playing football for their students before it split into the 2 codes of rugby and football. Some would argue it split because a public school boy cheated and picked up the ball and ran with it, but I'm sure the rugby fans amongst you will tell me that that's just a historical myth. Franco did likewise in Spain. He cultivated and increased divisions that already existed in the lead up to the civil war there. He took the tactic of favouring certain teams and demonising others in order to put forward his ideas in a positive light. He picked Real Madrid. I don't think he was even a fan of football, but he understood that this was a route to large numbers of people that watch the game. There's other examples that I'm sure listeners will be able to point to and see for themselves. In today's political leadership, you've got Bolsonaro in Brazil, Erdogan in Turkey. All of these look for endorsement from leading players. We've seen photos of them in their election campaigns with the best players from their countries. They're just as important as some of the business leaders that they have their pictures taken with. And if you're on social media, you'll see that every time that England score, it is quickly accompanied by politicians in ill-fitting football tops, showing just how with the masses they really are, cheering and celebrating the goals. Starmer, often referred to in the papers of him playing football and supporting Arsenal and England. And as an example of how it flows the other way, current England manager or ex-England manager now, Gareth Southgate, got embroiled in political matters. The one that springs to mind will be the players taking the knee to show their support against racism. This was seized upon by the right wing as being woke, and it gained an echo within the fans, within the fan base, because they populated that area up to now. So are able to put across their feelings on that in their way. Now, there's some on the left that think pastimes like football are designed to, or at least allowed by the ruling class, sort of bread and circuses trick of letting us engage in these, to oppress any sort of demonstrating or protest, and that way, it becomes a distraction. We shouldn't have anything to do with it. We should be concentrating fully on the route towards revolution. But whether that's true or not, I think's a little bit irrelevant, really, because the fact is, football's watched by millions and attended by millions across the world. It creates a passion and devotion that is equal to religion in a lot of places. It's passed down through generations and goes right to the heart of communities around the world. So when I see fans campaigning against ticket prices, I see ordinary people demanding higher wages and demanding an end to the profiteering of big business when they're protesting against takeovers of their club. What's that if not fighting for more democratic control? When they take over the clubs themselves, is that not just a community form of working class control and organisation? Supporters clubs, they're trade unions, aren't they, for the fans? When fans are complaining about the thousands that died, the thousands of migrant labour workers that died building sports stadiums for a country that has a litany of human rights abuses, I see that as a fight for workers' rights and international solidarity. So there are, if you think about it, very few concerns that are faced by football fans, either directly or indirectly, which couldn't be addressed by the minimum demands of a socialist or communist organisation. So there are fan groups such as those of Rayo Vallecano in Spain, St. Pauli in Germany, Celtic in Scotland, who have a fan base with left-wing or progressive ideologies. They're not perfect. And some of them have actually formal constitutions for the fans with left-wing or socialist ideas incorporated into them, and they're dominant within their clubs. Some have to fight fascist organisations in the streets or on the terraces, and have managed to combine their communities with the football club on that basis. There's organisations such as the Football Lads and Lasses Against Fascism, the Trade Union Football and Alcohol Committee, who've worked hard to counter the right's dominance within football culture and politicised fan bases. So there is potential to organise within football fans, within football culture. We've seen how easy it spills out into wider society. So we wouldn't be closing ourselves off in any way to a number of people, even though that is, we are talking about millions around the world. So I'll end by saying, I know sometimes it can be hard for people when they're seeing drunken louts throwing plastic chairs around some town centre somewhere during a major tournament, but you might not see the sort of revolutionary potential that has. But the right wing have, they've seen how that can be used and harnessed for their purposes. So I think the least that we can do on the left is give that a go. So I think I'll leave it there. I hope it can generate a bit of discussion around the ideas of whether football is an arena for politics and how the left organise within that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carl. Yes, it is. And I want to apologize for my slightly Philistine introduction. It's just the nationalism of, international sports event, I think is a bit much sometimes. But yes, I totally agree. I think like all questions that are important to the working class, we have to take it seriously. Like we have to take religion seriously as Marxists. We have to have answers for it, etc. And you said it is a bit like religion, but I do actually think there is, whereas religion will probably in a future socialist society will wither away, really. If if we know everything, we know that's the moon, that's the stars, there's no God, etc. That probably will wither away. I don't think the same can be said for sports. We just maybe democratize it a bit more. And I just want to know your thoughts on that. For example, you mentioned really the lefty groups. And there's a really good book. I think it's the wrong way around now, but it's called The Roaring Red Front. It's a really good book about sort of most left-wing clubs around the world. I can really recommend it. It's really highly interesting. But sort of in a sort of near future, I mean, in the past we had things like the Workers' Olympics, and we had an opening by Ben Lewis on this a few months ago, where there's still countries being represented, but it's done in a much more sort of fraternal way, and you don't have the flag shagging and stuff, and you have it in a more fraternal way, and the audience got involved, etc. How do you see it in a sort of near to far future? How would sport be conducted in a more sort of socialistic way, perhaps?
Yeah, again, I think if we were to look at football as we would anything else, as communists, anybody that studies communism knows that for a period there will be a crossover from capitalist society. So we would have to use some of the institutions and things that already exist within capitalism. So the same could be with the football clubs. If we go in from the fan base, from the bottom up, and reorganize them, if it comes to restructuring leagues, I don't think at the present time we'd be able to set up an alternative league while the current leagues, etc., exist. I think that'd be like looking at the unions. People have tried to set up unions against the ones that already exist, and that's fallen on its arse in most cases. So using what's there at the minute, yes, have them goals in the long term to completely democratize the game, bring it back to its working class roots. But that's not to say that it becomes poorer. I think a lot of the time when we're talking about ideals as communists, we put it across. There's been talks on this forum about primitive communism, and it seems like we're trying to drag people backwards in time. But in fact, there's many things that fans. I think there's a large amount of people that would look towards caps on wages for players, caps on transfer markets. So, that would only make the game, improve the game with fan engagement. So I think using the institutions that are there currently, as well as working towards, like you say, the examples of the Workers' Olympics and such, that could be used to further the game, because as you say, it's not going away. More and more people might be turning towards grassroots football as their little own protest. I mean, I'll go and watch semi-professional football now as my little protest against how big football's got. But these clubs are held so closely and deeply with people that isn't going to happen either. So the best way to do it is, like we say with society, from the bottom up, create a movement in order to take back what is ours.
And I thought in a society where we don't have to, labor away 8, 9, 10 hours a day, far more people would want to do it, and different sports as well, of course, not just football. And Peter's got a question.
Hi, Carl. Thanks very much for that. It was interesting because I've looked at this before myself, and what you mentioned very clearly is how football is a reflection of all the contradictions of wider society. The nationalism and you mentioned class struggle. So obviously racism as well, which you touched on, and it kind of reflects different transitions in society. As you mentioned, the early folk football as well, which had no rules, but then there was, those particular society weren't didn't have a fetish on rules about the boundaries of where the game should be played across villages and all the rest of it. And so it's a different beast today, isn't it? Because it's capitalist society. So that gets me to my point that how are you defining class struggle? So, because is it in Marxist terms? Because when I look at, you go to the match or you look at football supporters, and they can be from different class. Most of them are working class, but they can be cross class, so-called middle class, and even people with small businesses and that kind of thing can be, really kind of like keen football fans, season ticket holders attending and see themselves as traditional fans. So I was just wondering how you defined class and class struggle. And do you think there's any traction in seeing class struggle, just to add to that, as being premised, because it is capitalism, it is premised on, you know, the commodity form of football. You know, there's a struggle over the commodity form of football. Is any traction in kind of cement the class struggle to that, so we can distinguish between classes, by commodity form, that in many ways people see football as a kind of a community asset, to use a capitalist way of looking at it, but basically they're saying it's an object which has use value and it has a social end, but at the same time it exists as a business. So it's there to pursue profits, value, if you like. And so the commodity form has that rupture, that conflict. And in many ways, because rarely do clubs make a profit, elite clubs, and definitely clubs lower down don't. They rely on, the kind of transfer of money down the system, if possible, from the EPL to survive, or do rely on fans bailing them out. So, but even at elite level, they really make a profit, and even the owners say they're not owners really. The kind of moral agents, the custodians, and the fans believe that they're the real owners. So it is a funny old business, and that reflects itself in it being a funny old commodity. And maybe that's the traction we need to develop a class analysis out of that. So just ask your opinion of that.
Thanks, Peter. That's all we've got time for in terms of questions on this issue. So do you want to reply to Peter? Thank you.
Yeah, excellent points. And I urge people to go back and watch the session that Peter contributed to. He makes some excellent points, really starting at the basis of as he's touched on there, how we view things. So, this would come down to opinion, how you interpret, as you said, what constitutes a class. If we really wanted to have a macro look at it, you could say, you were making examples of small shopkeepers and stuff that go and watch football and might stand next to you. And when you're looking at a revolutionary movement, that middle strata has a choice to make, doesn't it? Does it fall in line behind the ruling class, or does it join with the upsurge and revolutionary movement? And through the ages, we've seen different middle stratas have made different choices. But with football, as you said, it's such a weird thing in that it is, if you like, viewed as a commodity. And people do view it as theirs and part of their communities. We've seen heroic struggles from communities taking back their clubs, dragging it back in to a capitalist model. Now, imagine if we were able to revolutionize fans to bring that back as being really theirs. Like you said, these so-called owners, yeah, they might be football fans, might be from the area, might have been watching the club forever, but it's that model in which they want to run the club. And they're going to help, even if they've got the best interests at heart, even if they're socialists themselves, they're going to need that push. They're going to need that nudge. And that starts with us, as you say, owning the clubs, maybe on a capitalist basis, but then transitioning that, like we will try and transition society in a revolutionary wave. So I think the way I was looking at class struggle was basically, from the feudal origins, those that were trying to ban and those that were trying to stop and those that were trying to punish people would have been from that strata of society. They would have been the ruling class. And there's an argument about how much that's blurred over time. I would say not much. They might look different, sound different, but there's still that ruling class that pull the strings, and that's the same as in football.
Thank you very much, Carl. Excellent presentation. I hope you enjoyed that, all comrades. We're now moving on to Shakespeare. And this is a three-part series that our comrade Luke Prodomu is preparing. Tonight, the first of three parts. As I said, it's on looking at Shakespeare and war and revolution. The comrade is a bit in poor health, so what I'll do is we've actually recorded the introduction before, and I'm going to show it now. And he's in the audience and can answer some questions after the session. So it's a really good introduction.
So welcome to this session on a Marxist approach to Shakespeare. Thank you all for coming along. There we are, there's our topic. And we're going to focus on particular aspects of this fascinating topic, I hope you'll agree. And today, the first of what I hope might be a series of webinars, we'll be focusing on Shakespeare, War and Revolution, from what I hope is at least a quasi-Marxist perspective. So those are our topics for today. War and Revolution, and how Shakespeare presents these still, I believe, relevant topics to us today. And to go straight into it, we're going to ask, is Shakespeare still relevant today? And to help me answer this question, I want you to think about one speech from Shakespeare that you know or like. Maybe it's your favorite speech. It doesn't matter what. I would just like you to think about this. And then I'll show you my favorite speech from Shakespeare. And today we'll begin to answer the question, is Shakespeare still relevant today from the point of view of this particular group? So are you thinking? I hope so. Okay. Famous speeches, you may come up with to be or not to be, or never a borrower or a lender be, whatever, it doesn't matter. Well, my favorite speech, which I'm going to take as an example, is this one from King Lear. And as we listen to it, I'm going to shut up and just play it for you with a video clip. And bear in mind, I'm going to come back to this question. Is Shakespeare still relevant today from our point of view?
Poor naked wretches, wheresoe'er you are, that bide the pelting of this pitiless storm, how shall your houseless heads, and unfed sides, your looped and windowed raggedness, defend you from seasons such as these? Oh, I have ta'en too little care of this. Take physic, pomp. Expose thyself to feel what wretches feel, that thou mayst shake the superflux to them, and show the heavens more just. Let the superfluous and lust-dieted man that slaves your ordinance, that will not see because he does not feel your power quickly. So distribution should undo excess, and each man have enough.
Okay, a couple of questions. Are there issues here which are still relevant today? And which of these issues remain unresolved today? Don't worry too much about the detail. I've highlighted some of the main points for you because the text can be a little bit difficult at times. But you're looking now to identify issues from King Lear, my favorite speech from the whole of Shakespeare, which are still relevant. Immediately, what springs to mind? You see poverty, you see homelessness, you see the difference between wealth and poverty. The pomp he refers to there is the rich, the privileged, in comparison to the wretched of the earth, the wretches, as King Lear calls them. And he's addressing himself as someone with power, wealth, and privilege, and saying, I had never really thought about this before, that there are such inequalities of wealth in my kingdom. Okay. And he does make a kind of wish at the end that the powers that be may use the extra wealth, the superflux, to distribute to the poor, to make the heavens, as he calls it, more just, or make the world more just. And let's focus a little bit more on what Shakespeare proposes, having identified some of the issues which still, I think, preoccupy us today: poverty, homelessness, inequality, and so on. Did you notice whether he proposed any solutions? And are they in any sense consistent with the political perspective we're taking in this webinar today? Well, this is part of his response to the problems is defined, identified, and quite simply, have a good look, he's saying that the wealth that has caused so much injustice, the inequality, there should be distribution to undo excess and each man have enough. That broadly is what he's saying is the solution to these acute issues he has defined, that the rich should be made to share their wealth. Now, what he means by this exactly, we'll see as we continue on our journey of exploration. One strong hypothesis has claimed that King Lear, particularly, is Marxist before Marxism. And this distribution should undo excess, and each man have enough, can be interpreted in that sense. But is that what Shakespeare means? Has he gone that far? Well, to get closer to answering this question, I want us to stand back, paradoxically, and look more generally at what Shakespeare writes about most of the time. And I want you to now to think of the topics that come up again and again in Shakespeare's plays. One way we can do this is for me to ask you to think of what the most common noun is in Shakespeare's plays. This might give us a clue as to the kind of issues that preoccupy Shakespeare. And we'll take this as a starting point. So think about topics that come up again and again. And if you can, guess the most common noun, because I'm going to show you a frequency count from the whole of Shakespeare's works, which tells us which are the most common nouns and therefore probably the most common topics which preoccupy you. Are you thinking of your noun? Make a guess. And here is what the computer has told me, looking at the whole of Shakespeare's works. This word cloud gives us a good idea of what issue Shakespeare comes back to again and again. And as you probably know, the bigger the word is in this word cloud, the more frequent the reference is to this word or this topic in Shakespeare's work. So you can identify, if you said, I think he talks a lot about love, well, you were right, it's there, of course. And a lot of you will have predicted that he does talk a lot about the ruling classes, which is why we have the word king in big letters. It's with love, the most frequent word, with lord. Lord here, of course, means aristocrat in the whole of his works. We could look at other details here, but that gives us a starting point. I mean, there's power there, you see. Power comes into it a lot. Queen, of course, comes into it. But the main focus I'm going to take as a starting point is the power of the aristocracy, the power of the elite in Shakespeare. And to begin with the base, with the material reality, what exactly did royalty, the aristocracy, the nobility, and the landed gentry, what role did they play? How much of the wealth did they actually control compared to the commoners, the ordinary people? And here I want you to try and guess the number which is missing in the blank there. It's the historical background, the economic background. And England was ruled, as we are told, by the royalty and nobility and the gentry at a local level. And they comprised about how much percent of the families that control the vast majority of them? Have you guessed right? Let's see. Well, it's a mere 2%. So there we have evidence of a gross inequality in Shakespeare's time. That's the background, or some of it, to the plays. On an ideological level, the next level in Marxist terms, superstructure, this was one way in which people saw their world, their worldview in Elizabethan times, the so-called great chain of being. And I want you to give me a word, or think of a word, an adjective, which describes the way this society is organized. You see, we have God at the top with the angels, and then we have the monarch, the leading aristocrat, then the nobles, the aristocracy, the church, the clergy, then the gentlemen who may have some land. At the bottom of the pile, with the animals, the plants, and the minerals, we have the commoners, the ordinary people. And that's, I hope, it gives you food for thought. Okay. We'll explore what this means in practice as we look at Shakespeare's texts more closely. But I'm going to go to the bottom of the pile, the commoners. Another word Shakespeare uses for the commoners is the multitude. What about the workers, I'm asking here. And I want to just have a look more closely at how Shakespeare sees the people. He was supposed to be a man of the people himself, if he is the man from Stratford. But how does he describe the people time and time again? Again, in the complete works of Shakespeare, I'm going to show you the adjectives which Shakespeare uses about the ordinary, poor people of Elizabethan England. See if you can guess some of those adjectives as I show you what the computer has generated. Well, there you are. You have a good look, and again, the bigger the word is, the more frequent is its use in the texts. And most of them, you see, have something in common, these adjectives, positive or negative. I would say they look pretty negative to me. And barbarous is pretty harsh. Rude is huge, and rude here does not mean impolite. It means something more like crude, vulgar. Bold doesn't really mean anything positive. It probably means having too much cheek, being rash and reckless in Shakespearean English, ignorant, heedless, and so on. The great multitude, that merely means there's a lot of them. But you can see what I mean. It's a very negative view of the people if we look at the work as a whole. And we're going to focus more closely on particular plays very briefly. We've already looked at King Lear. I wonder if you know these plays. Some of you will. I'm going to look at Henry V, Henry IV, Part 1, Henry VI, Part 2, a little bit at The Tempest, and I'm going to finish with Coriolanus to look at our two topics, war and revolution. Revolution is the first. I could have done it the other way around. But let's see how Shakespeare looks at rebellions, uprisings, and even revolutions. First of all, I'd like you to think, because I'm sure you have a lot of knowledge already about this, what caused the uprisings in early modern England, in Elizabethan times and just before? Can you think of the most common causes? We've already looked at some things which will give you an idea of the things that went wrong, the things that were wrong in that society. Let me just show you. I'm sure you guessed some of these. Causes for rebellion, either by the aristocracy leading the rebellion, or in some cases, the peasants, the poor, the commoners themselves. From the enclosure of common land, taxation, famine, the things we've mentioned, like gap between the rich and the poor, and war right at the bottom there, which we're going to come back to, because it was one reason why people rose up against the state. That gives you things that you've probably guessed already. Squabbles, of course, about the royal succession, I won't talk about today. They were mainly led by the aristocracy, conflicts between Catholics and Protestants. We're going to focus on the issues that affected the multitude, the ordinary people. And we're going to take a first historical example, Jack Cade's rebellion in the 15th century. This is just before Shakespeare's time, but Shakespeare writes about it in Henry VI, Part 2. And this is the historical facts, if you like, according to Wikipedia. And we should begin with the material facts before we look at how Shakespeare presents the rebellion in his play Henry VI, Part 2. Have a quick read there. It was a popular revolt. Aristocrats were involved and manipulated the revolt, but it was largely led by Jack Cade, the people, rebelling against corruption, bad administration, abuse of power, and of course war, which was going on and on and on. And that's why it's called the 100 Years' War. It lasted a long time. These ordinary people were often used as cannon fodder, and they just about had enough, along with all the injustices. Those are the basic facts of the rebellion. And we're going to look at how Shakespeare deals with this and what stance he takes, what ideological perspective he takes in Henry VI, Part 2. And there's Henry VI, he's a weak king, and the aristocrats are all squabbling amongst themselves about who's going to grab power during this weak kingship. But we're not going to look at that. We're going to look at the people. And the manifesto, the reasons that Jack Cade led the rebellion against the state in the 15th century. But before I show you his manifesto, and whether you like his manifesto, think about what you would put in your own manifesto if you wanted to be voted into power. And then we'll compare your manifesto ideas. Think, if you're not writing, think. And then it gives you something to compare to. And there I've summed up for you from the whole of Henry VI, Part 2, the main issues that the people are demanding. Some you will agree with, I'm sure some you will disagree with. I've grouped them into basically education in the first group. Second group is food, bread and beer and wine. The judicial system in blue there, and what they would do to the lawyers and courts. No money in the future utopia that Jack Cade promises. All citizens will wear the same uniform and so on. And of course, all things in common. Now think of which of these promises in the manifesto you agree with and think are a good idea. We need to look at context to make sense of all this. And particularly, as I said, to see how Shakespeare represents these arguments. Does he represent them seriously, or does he satirize them? Is he objective, or is he making fun of the people? Is he in favor or against the rebellion? And how do we know? We can only do this by what we were taught at university to do, textual analysis. And here to help us with textual analysis, I've used two colors, the red and the blue. The red are the claims that Jack Cade is making and the promises he's making. He's the leader of the rebellion. There's a picture from a performance in the theater. There will be no money. Everybody will wear the same uniform, livery uniform. And we will all be brothers. Brotherhood, I rather like that idea of brotherhood and sisterhood, of course. But notice the blue bit, and worship me, their Lord. Now, what does that do to the discourse? It tends for me, however serious the claims are, the arguments, it deflates, debunks, ridicules the serious arguments which the people might be making. And they're going to kill all the lawyers, of course, a very famous line. A lot of us might agree with that. How far does it get you, though? Again, look at the red and the blue. Well, in both cases, it seems to me pretty satirical. Notice the picture on the right from an RSC production, which they interpreted as an example, not of the left-wing rebellion against the state, but right, that's Michael Pennington, the actor, is a National Front leader in this version, okay, of the production. And notice here, Jack Cade is promising lots of good wine instead of pissing convicts will run nothing but claret wine. Well, it's a great idea, but it does sound like it's making fun. And notice again, we have the power-hungry authoritarian motif, treason for anyone that calls me other than Lord Mortimer. So he's going to be the Stalinist figure, the leader of this revolution. They attack literacy and people who can read and write, and for a good reason, as we shall see. But it's again quite undermined by the reaction of the ordinary people to this Clark Chaffin, who says he can write, and the response is he's a traitor because he can write. Now, why would they say that? And Jack Cade says, hang him with his pen about his neck. So they don't like literate people, educated people. Well, there's a reason for that, of course. The reason is that in the courts, when the people went to defend themselves, commoners, they were illiterate most of the time, they couldn't defend themselves. They couldn't read the accusations, and they were punished or even hanged. So there is a serious argument behind this attack on literacy and the judicial system, on education, grammar schools, and all the rest of it. Now, there's snobbery in this as well. Sir Humphrey Stafford says contemptuously to Jack Cade, your father was just a plasterer. Well, he's meaning to ridicule Jack Cade and make him look ridiculous and useless. But Jack Cade gives a quick and interesting response. What do you make of his response? Adam was a gardener. Why does he say that? What does it mean? Your father was a plasterer. Adam was a gardener. That's his response. And it reminds Sir Humphrey, who's a member of the elite, that they're fighting for their liberty. And come the revolution, there will be no lords or gentlemen. Some of you may have recognized the quotation about Adam and Eve from the previous great rebellion, the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, when John Ball, who was one of the leaders, intellectuals, if you like, of the Peasants' Revolt, made this famous statement, which some of you will know. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? What does that mean? It means we were all born equal, a bit like Rousseau. But everywhere we are in chains because by nature we were created alike. And the bondage and the servitude has been created, imposed on us by naughty men. So that's from the Peasants' Revolt. But it brings us back to Jack Cade and his rebellion. And I'll finish with this final example of the way Shakespeare gives us both something very serious, almost utopian, all things shall be in common, which I think a lot of us would be very interested in as an idea to develop. And then he deflates, debunks with my mouth shall be the Parliament of England. So he will be the dictator, a bit like Oliver Cromwell kind of was a dictator a few years later from Shakespeare. But does Shakespeare always do this? Is he always making fun of revolutions and rebellions? Well, I'm going to give you two examples where he doesn't make fun. He doesn't always satirize utopian ideas. I'll give you a quick example from The Tempest. Henry VI, Part 2, which we've just been looking at, was probably Shakespeare's first play. Probably his last one was The Tempest. Some of you will know, most of you will know The Tempest. This is Gonzalo. He's not a peasant, he's not an ordinary commoner. He's an aristocrat, and he's quoting Sir Thomas More's Utopia. So Shakespeare, at the end of his career, once again comes back to this idea of equality and a more just society, and indeed a very socialist principle. All things in common, nature should produce to feed my innocent people, says Gonzalo, the good man in The Tempest. That's all I'm going to do with The Tempest, just to show you that Shakespeare, over his career, developed a more serious approach to the people And the most detailed example of this, and interesting for me, is Coriolanus. I'm going to look briefly at the mass protest and rebellion in Coriolanus, which is a Roman place, so-called, but it's really about Elizabethan England, as we know. I'll tell you what I mean. The background to Coriolanus is, in fact, contemporary England, Jacobean England. Technically, it's 1607, the Midlands uprisings about the enclosures and the food riots. So this is what was going on if Shakespeare did indeed write the play at about this time. This is the material reality of his fascinating play about power, the aristocracy, and the poor. And that's the plot in a nutshell, conflict, if you like. Great film version by Ralph Fiennes, and he played Coriolanus himself. There he is on the right. He's also called Caius Marcius, or he gets the title Coriolanus for conquering the enemy. But things fall apart. The center cannot hold. And the conflict is between the people who see this aristocrat, militaristic figure, is a bit of a Mussolini in that respect. And he has total contempt for the people. And you see, he calls them fragments. We'll come back to why he tells them to go home. They're on the streets protesting. Go home, you fragments, he calls them with contempt. So what are they fighting about? Well, it's about food. It's about starvation. You are all either to perish. That's the choice the citizens have because they need corn. There is a shortage of corn, there is hoarding of corn, and they have to fight for a good price for corn. And there are echoes of King Lear here in the arguments that the citizen develops. And I think the argument is presented without that satirical strain that we saw in Henry VI, Part 2. The arguments are very coherent and very reasonable, you see. And the first citizen, one of the leaders of the rebellion, argues that there is more than enough grain for all of them. What authority surfeits on would relieve us, but they are not. The authorities, the powers that be, with Coriolanus at their elitist head, is refusing to give them food, and they are starving. This is the argument. The superfluity, echoes of King Lear there, the words surfeit and superfluity. And they think we are too dear. They don't think we're worth saving. They're saving money. They're actually gaining, as the citizens said. They're profiting. Our misery is a gain to them. But the multitude are not stupid here. They have very good arguments. As I say, the multitude has its head screwed on here. Let us revenge this with our pikes, ere we become rakes. I love the pun, rakes. Let's fight. We don't want to starve to death. And Shakespeare and the citizen point out that they are rebelling for reasons of hunger for bread, not for revenge. So this is a more positive presentation of the people. And the arguments go on. And they include laws, the legal system now, the judicial system. They say that people argue is making laws which are against the people and in favor of the aristocracy. Edicts for usury, money lending at exorbitant interest rates, which they can't afford to pay. And acts, statutes, acts, laws, which favor the rich, and statutes which are against the poor. And of course, the wars, the never-ending wars for which they were cannon fodder. And this is their argument, basically. And Shakespeare presents it almost seriously. And the aristocrats even know that the peasants are telling the truth. Menenius, another aristocrat talking to his mate Coriolanus, says what they want is corn at their own rates, whereas, as they say correctly, the city is well stored. So why doesn't Coriolanus, this militaristic hero figure, a very ambiguous hero, why doesn't he give them food? Well, there's a good reason why he doesn't give them corn at a reasonable price. He's hoarding it for his soldiers to supply the military. And that's why there is a shortage for ordinary. So hoarding of grain, which, by the way, William of Stratford was also accused of doing at the same time and was taken to court over hoarding of grain in a time of dearth. And to sum up the struggle here, the people say, we stand up for corn, and he, Coriolanus, or the establishment, their response is to scoff and call us many-headed multitude. They don't even have names, they're just a many-headed monster. And the play finishes with the exile of Coriolanus. He has nothing but contempt for the people. They exile him. He joins the enemy, and the enemy kill him in the end. And he says contemptuously, get home, you fragments, you common cry of curs of dogs, whose breath I hate. Nothing but contempt. He despises them, despises Rome, and he joins the enemy. There is a world elsewhere. The world he goes to is where he will be treated as a hero, but amongst the enemies of the people of Rome. So what do the words fragment and curs tell us about Coriolanus and how he sees the citizen? Well, we have to go back to the ideology of the time, or one of the ideological frameworks that we saw at the beginning, to see the significance of this. That's the society we saw at the beginning, the ideological framework. And you notice fragments links the commoners with objects. They're objectified, they're reified, if you like. They're down there with the animals, the curs, the dogs, and the minerals, the rocks and stones, fragments. That's what they are. So we have no time to waste. We have to say something about war and then bring two topics together. So Shakespeare and war. How does Shakespeare perceive war? Again, I've looked at the frequency of the adjectives Shakespeare uses about war, and we'll find some interesting contradictions. Can you guess how he describes war? Which adjectives he uses to describe war? And what does this tell us? We're going to see something which on the one hand is predictable. War is bloody, civil. That's civil war, of course. Cruel, deadly, ruthless, savage, and so on. A pretty bleak picture. There are some words which clash them. Words like noble, words like brave. I suppose if you look at the broader context, you will find that Shakespeare does see war in a contradictory way. But I'm going to focus on the role of the ordinary people once again, and take a quotation from Marx, which explains war in modern times, at least, as the imperial competition between states, commercial competition, the industrialization, which drove the states to compete and self kind of destroy each other. And of course, the innocent victims, the ordinary people who had to go to war for the commercial and industrial interests of the state. That's a basically Marxist view of war. We'll look at the slaughter of the innocents that Marx refers to and what it still means today. Let's go to Henry IV, part 2. This is the king on the left, Henry IV, who came to power by a coup, by actually assassinating his predecessor, Richard II. On the right is his son, Prince Hal, the future Henry V. That's the background. And now the king is giving his son, the successor to the throne, advice about war. What advice can you guess the king is giving his son? How should he conduct it? Well, this is what he says. My Harry, they're both called Harry, beat thy cause to busy giddy minds with foreign quarrels. It's a lovely phrase, to busy, to occupy, to distract, giddy minds. People easily taken in, people easily distracted, confused, giddy minds. domestic problems can be diverted by initiating foreign wars, foreign quarrels. That's the advice. Is it still advice that is relevant today in modern day politics, to go to war, to distract the people's attention from domestic issues? Do politicians still follow this advice? Is Henry IV Part II and Henry V still relevant today? Well, here's a slightly old headline, which confirms the hypothesis. The Falklands War is often considered as, amongst other things, a distraction to save Margaret Thatcher's political skin. Very unpopular at the time of the Falklands War, and after the war, her popularity rocketed and she won the next elections. So there's an example which suggests that Henry IV is giving advice to his son about using war as a diversion, which is still relevant, coming right up to date. We notice Netanyahu using war as a distraction, apart from the war in Palestine, which, of course, is delaying his facing up to justice for corruption charges. He's also using the Iranian threat, the possibility of war with Iran, to distract people's attention. So Shakespeare seems still to be relevant. Where does he get all this from? The most influential political theorist of the Renaissance was an Italian, and you guess who it was? Who advised the prince or the leader, the king, the duke, whoever was conducting a war, that this was the most important of the skills a politician needed, the art of war. The art of war. A prince should have no other object, no other thought, but the art of war. Conquest, imperialist conquest. Who said this? Well, those of you who see the word prince there will think of the book called The Prince by Machiavelli. And Machiavelli, before Shakespeare, had a great influence on Elizabethan and Jacobean theatre and political practice. And even today, he's still of great influence. Cynical, if you like, philosophy, a realpolitik, if you like, where the ends justify the means. And war is one end, or one means which justifies the ends. Now, I'm going to ask simple questions here and look at the text to see what the answers might be. Henry V is Shakespeare's play par excellence about war. And we often think of Henry V because of the propaganda around the play as a hero, an ideal king. Is Henry V, the former Prince Hal that we saw. He's in power now, and he's putting his father's advice into practice, going to war with France on a jump pretext. And on the right, we have another point of view about the same king, with Kenneth Branagh as the king, whereas Laurence Olivier's version is the one that became useful in the Second World War to rouse the people patriotically to fight against Nazism. But it presents the king as quite heroic, as we shall see. But there's more to it than that. So that's my question. An ideal king, a hero, or a butcher when he goes to war? Henry's army, let's look at his army. Is it humane? We often hear today about the humanity of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. What is the role of mercy and pity in the French campaign conducted by Henry V? Well, the answer is very simple. He tells the people of Harfleur in France that if they don't give in to his demands and allow him to conquer France and Harfleur, the gates of mercy shall be all shut up. And his soldiers will just go berserk, hard of heart, in liberty of bloody hand. They'll mow like grass your fresh, fair virgins and your flowering infants. The slaughter of mothers and children is what Henry V is threatening the people of Harfleur with. if they don't give in to his demands. But they're not just idle threats. He actually, sadly, goes ahead with some of this barbaric approach to war. I'm going to show you a modern headline, and I want you to match the headline with an extract from the speech from the same day, Henry V. The headline is about Israel and Palestine. There it is, and an Israeli politician tells us that the children of Gaza have brought this upon themselves in this genocidal war. What about Shakespeare? What does he have to say about this? Well, this is what he puts into the mouth of Henry V. Can you see the words there which match the headline of the Israeli general who says the people of Palestine have themselves to blame? Well, this is what the king, Henry, says. You yourselves are cause, if your pure maidens fall into the hand of hot and forcing violation. In other words, rape. Mothers and children, the slaughter of the innocents. So I go back to this question, an ideal king or a butcher? Shakespeare is great for taking different points of view. So he gives us this point of view. This is the king again speaking. What do you make of what he says about the French prisoners they have taken? That every soldier should kill his French prisoners because the French haven't given in yet. And he gives this order, which sounds to me like possibly what we would today call a war crime. Every soldier kill his prisoners. And he says it again, in case you had any doubt, we'll cut the throats of those we have, and not a man of them shall we take, shall taste that mercy. There will be no mercy for the French prisoners. So this is a pretty bloody, barbaric war, isn't it? Not much honor and nobility here. But what about the people? What about the workers? What did they say? Well, we'll see one worker, one ordinary man, one commoner, called Bates. And I just want to look at this extract and identify the pronoun he, his. Who is behind the pronoun he and his? Bates is talking. I would he were here alone. Many a poor man's life saved. Who is he? Methinks I could not die anywhere so contented, says Henry V, as in the king's company. His cause being just, and his quarrel noble, honorable. Honorable, interesting word, given what we've seen. The ordinary soldier, Bates says, if his cause be wrong, our obedience to the king wipes the crime of it out of us. So we're just obeying orders. We don't know whether it's right or wrong, this war. He has his doubts, Mr. Bates. And the point is, of course, that Henry V here is disguised, and the soldier doesn't know he's talking to the king. And that's why they use the pronoun he and his. They're talking about the king. And whether the king's war is justified and all the lives, the cannon fodder which is being sacrificed. Bates, you see, has his doubts. But Henry insists the war is just and honorable. If you look at Henry V, the play, you will find that Shakespeare doesn't quite say that the war is just and honorable. Much more ambiguous than that. And evidence that the people are being used as cannon fodder. I will give you this. Other names here of people or places: Bedford and Exeter, Warwick and Talbot, Salisbury and Gloucester. From a very famous speech. Are they places or people? Well, you've guessed, of course, they're all the names of aristocrats. And the important thing is that Shakespeare gives Henry V this great speech before the Battle of Agincourt. And the names that Henry is referring to at the beginning of this famous speech, Crispian, are the names of the aristocrats, Bedford and Exeter, Warwick and Talbot, Salisbury and Gloucester. They will be remembered when in future people talk about this war. They'll lose their lives, but they'll remember. You see, they'll be heroes. And we're all a band of brothers, he says. We few, we happy few. Does he include the ordinary people in this band of brothers? Well, he says he does, because he says here, for he today, 4 lines from the bottom, that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. He's a king, he's an aristocrat. His soldiers are ordinary people, vile. Bichineso, vile. Vile here means humble, base, crude, ordinary people. However vile you are, however much of a villager you are, a peasant, this day shall gentle your condition. Gentle is a wonderful verb made from the adjective gentle, meaning you shall become gentlemen. It's got nothing to do with being gentle as the opposite of hard or cruel. You shall be like gentlemen, like a gentleman in England now abed. And some of you will know how this speech continues. We don't need to go on. But he's saying that those who are here today who die in the battle of Agincourt shall be heroes. But the ones who are named are the aristocrats. And when they come to count the casualties on the French side and on the English side, it's the aristocrats who really, literally count. You see the titles there: York, Suffolk, Sir Richard, blah, 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 Esquire, a gentleman. None else of name. All the common soldiers who died in this are anonymous, unknown soldiers. And indeed, the great, you will guess who this is, Shakespeare's Falstaff in Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, and he dies at the beginning of Henry V. But notice the language he uses about the recruits he's having to muster for the war. One of his tasks as a friend of the prince, Sir John Falstaff, is to recruit soldiers. Look at the words he uses. Can you see? Such a commodity, interesting word, of warm slaves, slaves. Food for power, food for power. What we would call today cannon fodder, tushmen, mortal men, mortal men. They're going to die, and they have food for powder. That's all. They're just filling in, as perhaps some of the soldiers in today's wars are merely food for powder or cannon fodder. And I like the word commodity, because you know, he's making money out of this. He's taking bribes, Falstaff. In recruiting soldiers, he accepts bribes from those who can afford not to go to war. So he's crooked, a lovable character, but full of contradictions, as is the whole of Shakespeare's work, I think. Commodity of slaves. We're going to be used for the war. To finish, two endings, if you like, for Henry V, this play about war. One is a comedic ending where people get married and live happily ever after. Here's the king, he's conquered France, Henry V, Kenneth Branagh on the left, with Princess Catherine. And he tells her very explicitly, you don't have to hate me for conquering France, because I have all of France now, and I'm not going to part with the village. His imperial conquest has succeeded. He will have it all his. I'll have it. So you, princes, I'll have you as well. You shall be, my possession too, along with my other conquests, whether she likes it or not. I will end the main presentation before we come to discussion topics on this wonderful speech from Henry V about the virtues of peace. I'll shut up because I've talked a lot and let you just enjoy this vision of another world. Another world is possible, both for the rich, but particularly the poor, whose lives have been wasted, the slaughter of the innocents, and their lives used as cannon fodder. But Shakespeare gives us a very powerful speech. I call it a hymn to peace, from the same play as where we've seen the barbarous presentation of war. Just listen to this as a vision of another world is possible.
In Shakespeare's Henry V, the Duke of Burgundy appeals to the kings of England and France to consider the virtues of peace and to end a destructive war. I demand, before this royal view, what rub or what impediment there is, why that the naked, poor, and mangled peace, dear nurse of arts, plenties, and joyful births, should not in this best garden of the world, our fertile France, put up her lovely visage. Alas, she hath from France too long been chased, and all her husbandry doth lie on heaps, corrupting in its own fertility. And as our vineyards, fallows, meads, and hedges, defective in their natures, grow to wildness, even so our houses and ourselves and children have lost, or do not learn for want of time, the sciences that should become our country, but grow like savages, as soldiers will, that nothing do but meditate on blood.
There you are. I wanted to end on a note of hope, the vision of peace. And Shakespeare is as eloquent about peace and its beauties, its advantages, as he's eloquent describing the horrors of war and the other things we've looked at today. So there's modern day Palestine. And I think everything the Duke of Burgundy says can still be true, every single word about the tragedy of the war still raging in the Middle East and indeed between Russia and Ukraine. And this is what we have to lose, the other world that's possible. I don't have conclusions, but points for discussion. These are things, topics which have come up directly or indirectly in my presentation. My question to you, if you wish to discuss things, is Shakespeare still relevant today? And the things he says about these topics, from poverty to utopia, things in common, are they still worth listening to? Does he have things to teach us? Does he show a way not only to understand the present, but a way for planning the future and a better world? I said he's full of contradictions. A lot of people would agree the magic of Shakespeare is that he gives us so many points of view with such conviction, with such poetry. It gets us thinking. It's difficult to say where he stands. But as Walt Whitman said, the contradictions contain multitudes. And I like the word multitudes here because it takes us back to the people that we've been focusing on. I contain multitudes, says Walt Whitman. And Shakespeare too contains worlds, myriad-minded Shakespeare, Coleridge. Oh, he is large. He's a whole world, Shakespeare, and I still think it's relevant for today and for the future that we may like to plan. The other world, Coriolanus said, that is a world of a world of power and war, destruction. That's Coriolanus. And we reply, another world is possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luke, who is with us now. Luke, if you could switch on your camera, then we can see you. I think that was a really interesting way of presenting as well. And thank you for joining us. I know you're not well, so we'll try and keep this second part now a bit closer. Comrades, if you have questions or comments, please click raise hand. I mean, there is lots, as you say, there is lots and lots in Shakespeare, and there's lots of political analogies you can make to today and through history. What's interesting is, of course, I mean, he wrote way before Marx, obviously 300-400 years. He's pre-Marxian. He's not in a period of pre-socialism, or socialism existed, a form of socialism. And you could argue that Jesus, you know, talking about all holding things in common, was a kind of revolutionary, kind of socialist. And these ideas, socialistic ideas, certainly existed then. How would you, for my first question, would you describe Shakespeare's outlook? I mean, he was a court writer, wasn't he? So he was, on the one hand, he was kind of with the courts, with the kings, and that's a lot of his plays are about that. But he also talked about the other side, the people, etc. And then secondly, and that question has come up a few times in the chat, the fact that there are so many contradictions in Shakespeare's writing. Do you think that's an indication that maybe Shakespeare isn't just one person, wasn't just one person, but a number of people were writing under the name of Shakespeare together?
Well, Tina, thank you. Thank you all for your comments and your interest. You're touching on very sensitive ground here, Tina, as you may know. But in fact, the prevalent view now from scholars, both on the orthodox side, let's call it, and the skeptics on the whole story of Shakespeare, the whole narrative of the man from Stratford, is that indeed collaboration was common. And for example, you'll see the latest Oxford Complete Works, edited by pillars of the Stratfordian establishment, Stanley Wells and so on, actually attribute some of the plays quite openly now to other playwrights like Middleton and Green and Nash and so on. So that's accepted now, that there is something going on. We can't quite put our finger on it, but the multiplicity of views, the richness of the language, although the basic starting point, I would say the default position in Shakespeare, whoever he was, is clearly that of a courtier, that of the court, that of a feudal aristocracy in crisis. That's where he begins. And I think initially his language, the subtext of what he says, is tends to be sympathetic to the order, the hierarchy of things. And yet, somewhere, he or whoever else is involved in this can't resist being eloquent about humanity. And what that means is that, as you say, a man who is that sensitive to human nature, human issues, the way society is run and misgoverned, will inevitably stumble on ideas that centuries later, both Rousseau and others, and then Marx, of course, and in our own day, many, many writers have developed. He is very much a forerunner of the 17th century diggers and the levelers. I mean, by that, not that he himself believes that this is what should happen, but he can't resist expressing these ideas. Even in Hamlet, I discovered that that quotation from Henry VI, Part 2, about the Peasants' Revolt, where John Ball famously said, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman, and so on, and all this stuff about gardeners, which of course is saying we were all born equal. And somewhere along the line, these naughty men, the capitalists, the aristocrats, the feudal lords, they made us unequal. And this idea comes up again in Hamlet when the gravediggers are discussing things with Hamlet himself, an aristocrat who par excellence is a feudal lord in crisis who is questioning everything about the order of things. Something is rotten in the state of Denmark, something is rotten in the state of the feudal order. So the grave diggers actually do go back to John Ball. He was a preacher, but he was a radical preacher, and he literally proposed communism, and he was accused of being a communist, literally, even then. It may sound like an anachronism, but if you read what the man is saying, this preacher to Wat Tyler and the other peasants, he's actually talking about a society where everybody has equal rights and equal share of the abundance of the wealth. And Shakespeare seems to have this as an undercurrent in all his thinking. And when he gives you those wonderful speeches about peace and all the other virtues that humanity is capable of, he seems to see these things with a clarity which Marx envied. And of course, Marx worshipped Shakespeare, as did all his family, his daughter particularly. And he's as fanatical at Shakespeare as I am. And there are other reasons. In the second part, I actually talk about the plays he most discusses in his work, which are specifically Timon of Athens, in Capital, and The Merchant of Venice, which he comes back to again and again. And of course, it's all about money, and it's all about the growth of capitalism from feudalism. So he has a particular interest and a love for Shakespeare. I don't know, it's difficult to give an answer. As you've probably realized, I'm skeptical about the official narrative, and I think we should be, about Shakespeare from Stratford, the way he's been commodified, the way he's been deified, and people cease to see him critically as a man belonging to his own era, and not necessarily an individual genius, but a collaborator on his work, particularly his plays. I wouldn't say that about the poetry, but the plays definitely have concrete evidence of collaboration and a multiplicity of perspectives, which I think is what is unique, along with his incredible power with language. It leaves you speechless, his insight both into our humanity and his power to express this in the most unique language, you're ever likely to come across in the English language, at least. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Luke. We've got a couple of questions. I know you're, we don't want to extend this meeting too much, but Steve, go ahead.
Yes, that was a really interesting, really great talk. And it's one of those talks where when it's ended, you want to know some more, really. I think you're left thinking, let's hear some more. So, I don't know. I wouldn't really like to make comments on Shakespeare because I don't feel I know enough about it. Like most people, I've been to many of his plays and read some of his plays, obviously. But the connection that it made with me was that, funnily enough, was when you were talking about Jack Cade, because the funny thing was that in this election, we produced a manifesto, as you talked about, a manifesto of the Commonwealth of England. And it goes back to saying, that the 1,000 years of history of struggle between the Crown and the Commons. And that struggle between the Crown and the Commons, since 1066, in fact, goes right away through all those examples that you gave. And in the first part of it, up until the middle of the 17th century, when you have the actual Commonwealth being established, and then we get the redesigning of the Crown becomes something else. So in the earlier part, the Crown is the king, but in the later part, the Crown becomes really the collective noun for the state, and the power of capital becomes something quite different through that revolutionary process. Yeah. So in a way, when you were talking therefore about the idea of drafting a manifesto, it immediately connected. I'd love to send you, maybe we'll afterwards, I'll send you our manifesto, and I'd love your comments on it.
Thank you, Steve. That manifesto, by the way, I should have highlighted the point that when I presented Jack Cade's manifesto in Henry VI, Part 2, that was from Shakespeare's point of view. Yeah. If you look at the historical manifesto, it's actually much more grounded, much more socially aware and political, and all the ridiculous stuff that he chucked in, off Shakespeare, whoever he was, that, as I said, debunked and ridiculed the revolution, and it was an attempt to overthrow the government, in effect, actually was Shakespeare distorting history.
Yeah.
And there's a lot to discuss about the Shakespeare uses and abuses the historical facts to promote a particular point of view.
Yeah.
And it's not just broadly a feudal point of view with a sympathy for a feudal aristocracy in crisis, but a particular, well, it all leads up to the Tudors, as you know. He becomes a propagandist for the Tudor monarchs and for Elizabeth and all the rest of it, and the succession to the throne. He does take sides. And it's all very odd why the man from Stratford would do all of this, why he would spend play after play exploring matters of governance, of royalty, of the succession. I find it very puzzling but fascinating. Perhaps we'll never know. But the fact is the texts are there and they're incredibly rich. But we have to be critical. I think critical thinking is relevant. And when you deify Shakespeare and commodify him, as the Stratford industry has done, people cease to be critical. I mean, the more we connect him with his own time, the more we can see that he takes a very ideological point of view. Not always, but sometimes he can't help taking everybody's point of view. But he comes down, as I called it, the default position, and the way he distorts history. For example, give another example, Gaunt. There's the Duke of Gaunt in Richard II, who's presented as a good guy, one of the good guys. He was actually the richest man in the land. And the Peasants' Revolt, or Jack
Burnt his palace down, didn't they?
That actually, yes, he was the enemy. He was a really ruthless, won't
The
use
Strand, I think his palace
swear
was.
words about him. But he wasn't a nice man. He was the most powerful, the richest man in the kingdom. And Shakespeare in Richard II presents him as the victim of Richard II's, stupidity, his greed, the ruthlessness. They were both two, barons who were greedy and ruthless and elitist. And Shakespeare does distort history to present a sympathetic point of view for or against a particular side. But as I say, his genius is that he cannot resist articulating different aspects of humanity. That's why Coleridge called him myriad-minded Shakespeare. I think he can't help himself, and that's the great thing. I mean, T.S. Eliot, in his personal life, was a reactionary, anti-Semite, and all the rest of it, authoritarian kind of person. And yet his poetry tells you a different story. And it's the same with many poets, many creative people. Do you agree with what I'm saying, that it's one thing to take them superficially as a personality, and yet we remember them not so much for their personality. And about Shakespeare, we know nothing, absolutely nothing about his personality. We remember them for their work, which is because it's good poetry, because it's good theatre, will enrich us and will challenge us and encourage us to be critical and not complacent.
Thank you, Luke. Oh, sorry,
Very well.
Steve, are you still talking? I've muted you.
I just want to make a quick comment, obviously, to the people on, just to say that obviously he's talking about the class struggle of his time, and he's got two audiences, really. He's got the popular audience that also feel it from one side, and then he's got the people in charge who he has to keep on side as well, I guess. So maybe that's why he's takes the view towards Jack Cade, is to say those good things at the same time as saying, oh, he'll just be the Stalin, he'll betray you, he just wants to be the king instead of the king,
Again, history helps us, and it's important to realize that he was essentially a court playwright. His plays began their life in the Inns of Court and in Elizabeth's court, in the universities and then they went to the Globe, then they went to the people. He's often presented, you see, because of the Stratford narrative, as this man of the people who wrote for the Globe and reflected the interests of the people. Well, if you look at Hamlet, there's no way that is a play that would appeal to the, to the populace. It's an incredibly complex intellectual play. I'm not saying they weren't capable of understanding it, but there is evidence that he was a court playwright initially. And then in edited form, this is in a book by Richard Dutton called Shakespeare Court Playwright. He was a serious scholar, which says we can see evidence that the plays were initially written for the pleasure of the Queen and the courtiers who get all the in-jokes. And there are a lot of in-jokes, and they're often at the expense of courtiers. We see this in Twelfth Night, and only courtiers would know what the joke was about Malvolio, for example. You see what I mean? So there's a lot of evidence that it's good to start with the assumption that he's writing for a privileged audience, he's reflecting their ideology, and he takes it to the people and he makes fun of the people. Hamlet, if you look at Hamlet and what he says to the players and the way he mocks the crowd for their ignorance and inability to understand serious stuff in his plays, and just like a good clown, he's pretty contemptuous of the people's ability to appreciate his own work. If you take Hamlet as a kind of spokesperson, as the voice of the author, which many people do on both sides of the debate. Anyway, there's a lot. I mean, Hamlet in its original form, Steve, lasts 4 hours. The public theatres lasted a couple of hours. The 2 hours traffic of our stage, we are told, at the beginning of Romeo and Juliet. So who did he write those 4 hours for? It was 4 hours of Hamlet. If you play the whole thing, as Branagh did in the film version of his film, he played the whole thing, and it's a 4 hour almost length play, full of incredibly, obscure philosophical references to, intellectual currents of the time, and particularly infighting in the court, the squabbles within the court. And he's constantly going back to the importance of escaping the corruption of the court. This is where he becomes interesting. And he often sends his characters away from the corrupt court and its infighting and all the rest of it, to the Forest of Arden, to, Midsummer Night's Dream. They're all going, to the forest there, Illyria. It's always somewhere different, an alternative to the corruption of the official state. So whoever it is an insider with an insider's perspective of the state, who is disillusioned with the state and the corruption of politicians. And it's all in King Lear. I mean, King Lear makes this very, very clear when Lear tells Cordelia, let's away to prison. And he'll mock the politicians as they come in and out of power. And he takes a distance, a critical distance from the court that he himself has rejected. And that wonderful speech I began with about the poor and how he's never been aware of his citizens, his subjects suffering. It says a lot about how critical this man was of the established order, and yet he was a part of it as well. And there's the contradiction.
We've got a couple more questions from comrades. We're trying to finish by 9, so try to keep it short if you can.
That's
John.
kind of you if you have to finish, but I'm ready and raring to go.
Finish by 9, sorry.
Okay.
My daughter to bed. John.
Right, thanks Tina, thanks Luke. That was great. Just a couple of points I want to make. First, on the earlier contributions on football, and I've been a football fan all my life, and I'll put things in the chat about that. But I think we could have heard a lot more about the fight back. Certainly in the 1980s, the Football Supporters Association the whole fanzine movement, which was very aware that there were attempts from on high, particularly after Hillsborough, and the way in which the Jimmy Hill led the entire state into interpreting what had happened and pushing all-seater stadia on us. Lots of fans knew what their agenda was and actually organized a fight back against that, fighting back against Thatcher's attempt to impose ID cards on football supporters was one thing. I won't dwell on that. I fell in love with Shakespeare at school with the plays that we covered. And one of those was Julius Caesar. And I just loved the character of Gaius Cassius in that. Brutus was portrayed by Shakespeare, I think, as the tragic hero who had been the instrument of killing his greatest friend, Julius Caesar. But it was clear to me at that time that Brutus was not an ideological Republican, but Cassius was. And I think that takes us back to the central point which Luke seems to be making, that Shakespeare, whether one or several people, is full of contradictions, just like capitalism, just like football. And we need to take what we can and take what is relevant and useful to us in the 21st century from great writers like Shakespeare, and I would argue Machiavelli as well. I read Machiavelli for my degree, not just The Prince, but the Discourse as well, which I thought was a better book. But I think they're both great books. And I think Shakespeare did present if you like, the official narrative's way of interpreting the subject matter alongside something more radical at the same time. And he certainly did that in Julius Caesar. And I think Luke has shown how he continued to do that throughout his writing career. He or she or them or whatever. Probably we should use a pronoun of choice about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well,
Luke, just a second. I'm going to take Anthony as well now, please. Yeah, and then we can answer both questions together, if that's okay. Thank you. Hi, Anthony. You need to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
A few sentences. What's the first one? Yes, the Plantagenets were the most dominant royal family for 150 years in most of Western and Central Europe. The 100 Years' War came out of this. Joan of Arc rebelled, a middle-class peasant or urban woman, and led the rebellion against England. The Jack Cade Rebellion preceded the War of the Roses. Steve said them. Shakespeare reflected the vacillations of the middle class. But one of the interesting things is when you were watching Michael Wood's Shakespeare in 2003, it's on DVD, I don't know if it's on YouTube, the dialectics were going through the coming, being, and ending in the grammar school. But I'll now go into the more contemporary significance. We want to totally, not just redistribute that, we want the expropriation of the capitalists under workers' control. That's one thing. Even the clause 4 adaptations to the right, which is left social democracy, poses that democracy. We can't be to the right clause 4 social democracy. I think there's elements of that from what Luke's saying. The other thing is, it's not just entry imperialist war. There's wars of recolonization. The left communists didn't see colonialism and the necessity of fighting that from the 20s to the 70s. And then the worker states are a separate category on their own. But it's not just the main reason they wanted that Kosovo point. Alistair Burt was, he's normally a liberal, was very hard on that. That the 40 countries wanted to join the BRICS, and I'll finish on this. And the Chinese, Stalinist bureaucratic caste and the workers' state, India, Bushi don't want these countries joining because they wanted more of imperialism. Because Pakistan joined Saudi Arabia's Beliefs and Iran together, and the other thing about that's one thing on the BRICS. I'll finish there.
Thank you, Anthony. Okay, Luke, perhaps you could use your answer as well to sum up, because we will have to come to an end now.
Well, thank you, Anthony and John, for your comments. I can't really comment on what the last speaker questioned. I couldn't quite see the connection, but I think it's important to reconnect Shakespeare, let's say, with his historical context. This idea of killing Caesar that was mentioned, killing the monarch, it comes up again and again. And I'll just end on this interesting example from Richard II, where we see a monarch, as I mentioned, being assassinated by his successor, Henry IV. And this play, Richard II, was put on in 1601, if I remember correctly, by the Globe Theatre at the request of the Earl of Essex and his rebels who turned against the Queen Elizabeth. So the Essex faction used Shakespeare's play, Richard II, because it showed in its uncensored form a monarch being deposed, just like Julius Caesar does, shows a monarch. And Shakespeare is always, I think this is an important point to make, even when he's talking about the Romans, which he took from Plutarch, he adapted very much of what was in Plutarch, Plutarch's Lives, to his own period. So I would like to end with an appeal for us to see Shakespeare, to recontextualize Shakespeare in the social and political context of his time. And I think he will make even more sense to us and be more useful in our own planning of a better world if we see how he's rooted in the problems of his own time. The Essex example I gave, where, his company, strangely enough, not the man himself, was hauled before the Privy Council, and they had to explain why they allowed their play Richard II to be used as propaganda for the Earl of Essex, who had turned against the Queen. Again, it's the barons squabbling amongst themselves. It's not really about ordinary people. For that, we have to go to Oliver Cromwell, the Levellers and the Diggers, and even go back to John Ball and Wat Tyler and the revolts of John Cade and so on. So I think it's interesting to look back from Shakespeare and to look forward to what happened with the Puritan Revolution and then its aftermath, which brings us up to the present day and the constitutional monarch that we saw in action again yesterday. And I used actually in my presentation of the King Lear extract, King Charles in all his pomp and circumstance. So very much still relevant today. And I hope I can see you all again for part 2 of this sometime in the future. In the meantime, thank you very much, Tina, for putting up with me and my problems and delays and so on. And I hope to be on better form next time. Thank you very much. See you again.
All right, look, you did a brilliant job. I think there was lots of good comments in the chat as well. A lot of people enjoyed your presentation very, very much, and the question and answer was very insightful, and I enjoyed it massively. Thank you very much. We had really 2 excellent introductions today. Good questions from the audience as well. Thank you very much, everybody. As Luke said, 2 more sessions at least planned with him. On one of them is Shakespeare and his Unruly Women, which I'm very much looking forward to. Next week, we're taking a look at Mark Fisher and acid communism. And a comrade, an opera singer, will actually talk about why we shouldn't be reversed snobs about opera and why the working class should take that seriously. I hope you can join us next week. Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Carl. And thank you to everybody in the audience. Good night.
Thank you very much.